Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and we're here today with Paul Leonardi, who teaches technology management at University of California, Santa Barbara. Also, the author of a couple of books. This book from a couple of years back, I forget what year it was, co-authored, called The Digital Mindset: What It Really Takes to Thrive in the Age of Data, Algorithms, and AI. And this new book called Digital Exhaustion: Simple Rules for Reclaiming Your Life. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Well, I feel like, these two books, it's kind of like a 1-2 punch, because the first book is trying to get everybody all excited about digital and embracing it and so forth. And then the second book is, okay, now that you've done this, right, how do you recover your sanity, right? And it seems like if you're teaching a course on technology management, you're going to be talking about what digital technologies can do for you, but you're also kind of talking about what they do to you, right?
Fair.
And it seems like part of what you're doing is teaching people how to use these tools themselves, but you're also teaching people how to, as managers, right, design an environment where the tools work with your people to get the most out of your people without kind of, destroying them.
For sure.
So I guess before we jump into the Digital Exhaustion book, I want to know a bit more about how you approach teaching technology management, because in this book, Digital Mindset, you talk about the 30% rule, and you talk about how, you don't need to be, and this is before generative AI even, but you didn't need to be like a coder. I mean, you teach in the engineering school. I teach mostly in the business school, but also in engineering. And the question that my students always have is, how deep do they need to actually go into the technology to be effective users of the technology and managers of a technology company?
Okay, there's a lot of stuff there, and I love it. You're right on to these important topics. So first, 1-2 punch with the two books, absolutely. And I think the reason is that we are complicated people. Humans, right? Like, our technologies do great things for us, and they give us all kinds of capabilities and advantages. But at the same time, they expose us to more information, more stimuli, and the fact that we've got so much of it wears us out. And so I felt like, the entire time that I was writing Digital Mindset with my colleague Sadal, people were always talking about the great things that these tools can do to help their businesses and make their lives more effective. But there was always a dark side just looming right under the surface, that for every tool that I use, there's a price that I pay. And sometimes that price is my sanity and my energy level. And so I really felt like, after I finished the Digital Mindset book, that there was another story that we needed to tell. And that story was about, how can we get all of the good things that we talk about in the Digital Mindset book and not get that terrible feeling of overwhelm and exhaustion that comes, it can come from using the tools in the ways that give us the good things. So that's why there's the sort of 1-2 punch of these two books. And when we think about this in terms of the curriculum that we have at UC Santa Barbara in technology management, we're kind of thinking along the same lines, that technologies that are becoming available today give us an immense array of promise and capabilities, right? We can do things with, ChatGPT. We can do things with our phones that are unimaginable just a decade ago. And that has all kinds of great implications for how we work, how we play, our family lives and everything. But we only can do that. We only get those advantages if we learn how to see the possibilities for using the tools. And so this gets right to the heart of the 30% rule, that you don't need to be an expert in how a tool works, like the programming of the tool, in order to be able to use it effectively. But you do need to have enough skill to be able to unlock the potential of it, to unlock the features. And I think we're definitely seeing this now with the generative AI revolution, that it's really easy to type something into that ChatGPT context window and get garbage out on the other side. And it's deceptively simple to think that I could just put in a few words and get something of great quality. And I think what many people are finding is No, I have to actually, if I know more about how these tools work, if I know that they're probabilistic machines, if I know that they are looking at a really broad data set to identify patterns, but if I can train them a little bit more finely with data that I have within my organization, that my responses are going to be better, that the answers will be more accurate. So you get that by knowing a bit about how the tools function, but you don't, again, need to understand exactly the mechanics of a neural network to do that. And then you can see all the possibilities that you could unlock. And so that's what we're really trying to teach students in technology management. How do you see those possibilities? How do you do it in a way that avoid some of the negative consequences that I talk about in the Digital Exhaustion book? And then how do you speak the language of technology such that you can talk to other people across your organization who may be in marketing or sales, legal, that don't speak that same language, and then you can connect them to the more technical parts of the organization.
So it's like if you're learning to be a truck driver, right? You don't need to know about how carbon molecules are broken down inside of an internal combustion engine, right?
Right. But you often do need to know how to do a quick repair to an engine, right?
Uh-huh.
So if it overheats on the side of the road, is there something that you can do to get moving again? And that's sort of similar, I think, to how we approach most of our digital tools.
But I think about when you think about technology management, I mean, the technology that most managers are managing is the carbon-based technology that sits in our skulls, right?
Mhm.
Because, and yet, most engineering curricula, this human factor class was sort of like a bolt-on, right?
Right.
For many, many decades. I mean, do you think that within engineering, we really do need to spend kind of more time understanding the the tools that sit in people's brains, right? I mean,
Oh,
yeah, and we're
100%.
seeing a convergence between computer science and psychology, where we're understanding, okay, there's processing and there's storage and there's battery life. And this book is about the battery life part
Yeah.
to a large extent. I mean, are those sorts of things that we need to spend more and more time thinking about within engineering?
Absolutely. And that's really the thing that I'm really excited about at the Moravian College of Engineering here at UCSB is when I came here in 2014, the charge was to build not just a course, right? That human factors course, or often in engineering, it's like an ethics course, is like the one people course that the engineers take. But not to do that, but to build a whole department of technology management that is focused on the interplay between people, organizational processes, and technology. So students across the college, whether they're taking courses in, mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or computer engineering, whatever it might be, are taking our technology management courses, multiple of them, that help them to understand, okay, if I'm built the way that my organization is designed is going to shape the kind of technology I can build. My conceptualization of the market and who I think, what I think are going to be the lead use cases for my tool shapes if I'm going to be able to commercialize this particular technology. If I'm trying to create change in my organization by driving some kind of new technological capability, that's only going to work if people adopt it and use the data that those tools produce to change the way their work happens. And that's the kind of stuff that we're teaching across the curriculum. What's interesting about it too, though, is what we've noticed is there's a similar thrust, but from the other side of campus, from humanities, social sciences, where you have people that understand the technology of the human brain pretty well, but also need to understand, well, how does that interact with all of these tools that we're using? And how do I think about applying these in the context of organizations that are constraining what I can do with my human intuition and human agency? And so we see an equal number of students interested in taking our classes that are trying to understand sort of technology from a more humanist perspective. And that makes for the most exciting conversations in our classrooms because you've got engineers and humanists and social scientists together looking at problems from different vantage points and not always speaking the same language. So our job is to teach them, how do you become effective translators and communicate in this trading zone between all these different communities?
Well, look, I mean, if we look at something like the iPhone over the last, however long it's been
Yeah.
since it was created, 16 years or whatever.
Right.
I mean,
2007, I think.
yeah. So
Yeah.
each new generation, right, has faster processors it has, more storage, and it has to have better battery life in order to support this. But the human brain, I mean, it hasn't changed that much,
No,
and,
it
and
hasn't. And
so
that's,
we're asking it to do, like, more processing and to store more data. But I mean, we've got the same battery, and I think that's the problem that you're talking about in this book.
it's certainly one of the big ones. We evolved to match the environments that we lived in, and they were slower moving environments than the ones that we have today. And if you look, and I did a lot of sort of, I'm not a brain scientist, but I did a lot of research about this, reading about it for this book. And the conclusion that that community seems to make is that we are not multitaskers. We're not evolved to do that. And the way that our brains work is that, they engage in one area of focus, and we have to then fire all these neurons to disconnect from that. And that creates a chemical response. Then we connect to a new stimulus, and we do it sequentially. And we can fool ourselves all day long into thinking that we're amazing multitaskers. But the reality is, our brains just didn't evolve to take in so many different information inputs simultaneously and to process them the way that we do, or the way that we're asked to do. And, I don't know, will that change in a million years? Maybe, but today we're stuck with, a disconnect, I think, between what our cognition really allows us to do and then what society expects us to be able to do. And the weird status that we've also associated with people who can juggle multiple information inputs and, do in crazy amounts of multitasking. You see this all the time. Like, I don't know how that person gets so much done. They're doing 3 things at once. Or, if you see people, this is certainly a phenomenon of the last decade or two, sitting in meetings, they almost feel like they need to be pulling up their laptop and doing something while they're in the meeting, or they don't look like they're being productive, which is crazy.
Well, I mean, it seems like with all this new technology, we should be able to do less, right? We should be able to delegate a lot of this stuff so that we can actually have calmer minds and kind of work on a smaller number of tasks. But it seems to be going in the opposite direction. Why haven't these things kind of become substitutes for what we used to do with our brains?
Yeah, well, I can speak to the symptom first. The cause, I'm not exactly sure, but I can speculate. I think the symptom is that we have so many different devices and applications that channel all kinds of different information to us in different ways and at different times. And, for the book, I worked with a lot of people where I asked them to track, how many tools do you use on a daily basis, and, applications, devices, et cetera. And most people hovered just under 40, right? 40 different tools that they're moving across in one day. And if you think about that, each of those tools is giving us different kinds of information. Each one has a slightly different way of accessing that information. They have different interfaces that I have to get familiar with. Remember where button A is on one side and where button B is on another. And so we've constructed this moment where we certainly have unparalleled access to information, content, capabilities than we've ever had, but it's all coming to us at different speeds and in different contexts and in different ways and in different applications. And it creates this immense drain on our energy to be able to manage all those inputs. So one of the things that could happen with AI, if it moves in the right direction, is help us to do more of that, single thread living. That idea that we don't have to go out to so many places to get the information and switch across so many applications. But if that can be coordinated and homogenized and put into one bucket for us, and we go to one place to find it all, that could be helpful. Or even more helpful if these tools can start to do a good job at anticipating what are the things we're going to need. So it tees me up with, here's your little summary of what you need to go into this meeting that you're going to have in 15 minutes or an hour or whatever it might be. I think those are the kinds of places I'm optimistic that our tools are going to help push us towards. In many ways, it's not that our tools are going to save us from our tools, but I do think that we could build applications, if we take digital exhaustion seriously, that would help us to be, much more succinct in the way we access information and in ways that conserve our energy and attention.
Yeah, and it seems like the problem is that all of these things are being funneled through some bottleneck, right?
Yeah.
Like prefrontal cortex and so forth.
Yes.
I mean, when we think about, how easy it is to walk while you're chewing gum, or, I have my cars are all old. And the reason why I like old cars is because they still have like knobs
Yeah.
and buttons
I
and,
know.
levers and things. And, when you're kind of adjusting the radio while you're monitoring the speedometer, like these are using sort of parallel systems, right? And so you can do things in parallel rather than in serial. And if you run everything through a single interface, like a dashboard with drop down menus and so forth, we know from the UX research that this creates problems. I mean, and so
Yeah.
is the main problem that we're just funneling everything through a very, very finite part of our cognitive resources?
That's a fun question. I haven't really thought of it in that way before. And the metaphor that came to my mind when you were saying that was like the fuse box in your house, or the circuit breakers. Like,
Yeah.
the more modern interpretation of that. If you plug all your electric heaters into the outlets that are hooked up to one circuit, you're going to overload that circuit and it trips the breaker. If you spread that out across multiple circuits, then you're usually doing okay. So what would be the analogy of that in our daily lives? Like there's sensory motor processing, right? Like things that we can do that are pretty tacit, like just reach out and turn that knob without having to think of it. We can glance at the speedometer, and that's like optical processing. And then we could probably be also listening to the radio at the same time while that's happening, right? Some auditory processing. So you have information coming to different senses. So I don't know, could you imagine a world where we stop delivering everything visually, and we deliver other things haptically or auditorily? That's kind of a cool way to think about it. I've not thought about it that way. I guess the way that I've thought about it mostly is, given that we tend to consume most of the content, right, visually and through screens, especially these days, can't we just figure out ways to reduce the amount of content that are coming to us? So I think that's a big problem, is that we orient to our devices and we use them in ways that are pushing us towards the maximum amount of content possible. And certainly that's by design from the companies that are pushing the content at us. We don't have to go into that conversation. We know that that's what's happening. And so we need to be better at developing some self-defense strategies so that we can modulate our intake of all of that content, or else it's going to trip the circuit.
Yeah. And of course, you're talking about switching, and
Yeah.
there's different types of switching. There's the context switching,
Right.
There is device switching, right? There's domain switching, right? And each one of these switches leaves behind, and I love this metaphor of attentional residue. I don't think I'd ever heard that term before, and the image of the whiteboard with all of the ink still,
It's still there.
still on it, right? And I think, when I sit in the back of my classroom occasionally, or someone else's classroom, and I see what's going on, and people are on their screens, they're not ignoring the class because they're immersed in some kind of text. They're typically switching back and forth between, they're reserving some tickets, and then they're, looking at the sports scores, and then they're moving over to the email. And, it seems like this has become a habit, right? It's something that people feel almost uncomfortable if they are focused on one thing for an extended period of time. Why have we failed to appreciate the, not only the productivity aspects of being present and being focused and in flow, but also kind of the pleasurable aspects of this type of concentration?
Yeah. So much of the discussion is around focus and distraction these days. And, if only we could keep those distractions at bay, we would reclaim focus and life would be great. Certainly, there's great research, and I cite a bunch of it in the book about the importance of getting into flow for a variety of activities, and that's it's a state that helps to generate energy rather than suck it from us and deplete us. So yes, that's absolutely important. But what I think we've failed to look at is how it's not just being distracted that's a problem, but it's the act of switching itself across all of these different inputs really is a significant source of our exhaustion. And as you mentioned, there's a couple of different ways that we switch. Just switching between or amongst devices or applications is exhausting, if for no other reason than, you are having to reorient, even if it's brief, to this new way of interacting with data, the new interface. I certainly experience this when I'm switching across video conferencing applications.
Right.
And I'm sure, you, the listeners, right, have experienced that feeling of dread when, you're on a newish platform that you haven't used very much. And then someone asks you to share your screen and you're like, oh, shoot, where's the share screen
Right.
button here? And you try to do it and it's like, oh, well, you haven't set up Google to record your screen. And so you have to go into your settings and it's like you get flustered. Those little things that just kind of seem like annoyances are really the little bits and bytes that add up to our exhaustion. And I distinguish between what I call level 1 and level 2 exhaustion. Level 1 exhaustion, and you can use your battery as an example, on your phone. Level 1 exhaustion is those daily charges and depletions. And we experience those as we're switching between applications and doing the things we just talked about. Those are natural, and we kind of get depleted, and then we rest and we recover. Well, like a phone only has so many cycles in which it can recharge before the battery gets depleted. That's level 2 exhaustion. And what I've seen in my interviews, surveys, the data is that most people don't complain too much about having to find that share their screen button on Microsoft Teams, let's say. They're used to just kind of like, okay, that's a little bit of a frustration, fine. But when you experience that day in and day out over a period of multiple weeks or months, that's when we start to feel that level 2 exhaustion. That feeling of I'm busy, but I'm not productive. I'm behind. I feel behind even when I'm caught up. Small digital tasks feel extremely and oddly draining. You scroll without wanting to, right? It's like those kinds of things are symptoms of level 2 exhaustion. And that's where I think the real trouble begins, because then we feel dispirited, demotivated, and we sort of like are uncomfortable with the devices that we're on and the data that we're accessing.
No, I think you did a bunch of empirical work, right? You went around to these different companies and
Oh, yeah.
asked people what their subjective feeling of exhaustion was. I was wondering if you could just talk about that. So, did you already have a hypothesis about what was going to be driving that? Were you able to kind of dig in and figure out what the drivers were by doing questionnaires and so forth? I mean, how did you really unpack what was driving this?
Yeah, well, to answer that, we need to go back to the early 2000s. And I did, when I first started in graduate school, I did 2 different research projects. They were very different from one another. One was at a big atmospheric research center where scientists were creating weather models and to help the FAA and Department of Homeland Security, et cetera. And the other was with housekeepers at the university that were using this new ticket managing tool. And I heard the same thing in both of these studies, right? From PhD scientists and these folks that were cleaning the residence halls, about how trying to use these new tools was exciting and it was helping their work, but it also felt really exhausting to learn how to use them. And in particular, they had all these other tools that they were supposed to be using. Some, not all were digital, like in the case especially of the housekeeping folks, but that switching across those tools was exhausting. Now, this was the early 2000s, really different data landscape and technological landscape than we had today, right? I mean, a lot of people didn't even have broadband internet in the year 2000, right? So the information inputs that we could access were far fewer than they are today. And it struck me that you had these two very, very different groups of people using very different kinds of technologies that were saying the same thing. So that for me was the impetus to start asking questions that were formal about exhaustion. So almost every study that I did after that was not about exhaustion. It was about, like, how could this tool drive changes in work? How could we revise our business models or our operating models given the capabilities that these tools give us? All the kind of stuff I talk about in the Digital Mindset book. But I always ask the question kind of at the end. Sometimes it was an interview, sometimes I'd give it in a survey. Like, how much do the tools that you use exhaust you? And tell me why. And that I sort of accumulated that data over the years and started to develop just some insights from asking those questions. But when COVID hit, that was the first time when I actually heard people really using this term that I'd been thinking about for a long time. Like, I'm so exhausted. And they would tell me, many people, like these friends, family, would tell me, well, like, my work's going great, but I'm exhausted from being on Zoom all the time. I didn't have to do every single thing on a digital platform, but now I do. And I'm just like staring at the screen and I'm scrolling and I'm just feeling depleted. And man, this is really wearing me out. And I thought, well, maybe it's burnout. And so I asked people the sort of typical burnout questions, from like the Maslach burnout inventory. And people didn't seem to be burnt out on their jobs. They just seemed to be really tired with all the technology they were using. So that was, for me, the catalyst of saying, okay, well, I've collected all these data just because I was interested in it. Now's the time to go back and say systematically, could I do something with all of these insights that I've been collecting? And then, of course, I had to do some more research to try to help figure out how could we combat this problem of digital exhaustion.
Yeah, I mean, it's really weird because one would think that there is a relatively transparent measure of mental energy, right?
Yeah.
So if someone's sitting there coding for 8 hours, you would think, oh my gosh, they're using their brain an awful lot, so they're going to be exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
But in this story, they might actually turn out to be less exhausted because they were engaged in a kind of a single task and they didn't have to do any switching. So, I mean, it would be great if we could somehow, I don't know, measure glucose consumption or
Sure,
something,
right? As an indicator of exhaustion or something like that.
Yeah, but it doesn't seem like there is a simple and straightforward way of measuring mental energy.
No. And, interestingly also, our bodies aren't really good at indicating to us what our level of cognitive exhaustion is either. Our bodies do a much better job at telling us if we're physically exhausted, right? Our muscles ache, right? It's like hard to stand, you feel like you're sleepy. But we don't have similar physiological or, biophysical cues for mental exhaustion. And I think that means that we can push ourselves a lot longer, a lot harder, and then you hit a wall. It's like people that have really high pain tolerance because they have, muted neuroreceptors, and they can get much closer to heat than the normal folks with, actively functioning neuroreceptors can, but then, it's easier to get burned, right? And so that's the situation I think we find ourselves in with mental exhaustion. And so I think starting to recognize a few of these symptoms that, like I described, that kind of anxiousness that you're feeling about, like, I got to look at this other screen, or really the telltale sign that everyone tells me about is sort of two things. One is I find myself like, I just keep reading through my emails, or I'm just, going from one link to another link and I'm not doing anything, right? I think that's a real good indicator that we're feeling that digital exhaustion. That like I'm there, but I'm not actively processing anything, and I don't have the ability to start doing a meaningful kind of work. The second thing, which is odd too, is people have described to me the folks that are the most digitally exhausted, this tractor beam like pull to their phones or to be on their devices, like to be in front of the screen. It's almost like, being in an abusive relationship, right? Like I need to be in front of the screen, even though the screen is the thing that's really the source of my exhaustion. And so often when people tell me, I find myself always picking up my phone, but nothing happens. To me, that's a great sign that you're experiencing digital exhaustion.
Yeah, and this gets to your point of intentionality, right? So a lot of us, we're not actually in charge of the sequence of work. I just flew back from Europe a couple days ago, and I read 4.5 books. It was amazing.
Amazing. Yeah.
I didn't sign up for the Wi-Fi, and it was
Yeah.
like, oh wow, look at this. And of
I don't
course,
either.
I could have read those 5 books, in the previous days, but no, I had to actually be on this plane where my phone was more or less useless.
Yeah. It's funny. I never get the Wi-Fi on the plane. Never. Um, and the reason is that I really like that time to just focus on
Yeah.
things. And it can be intense. A lot of times I just, have my email set to offline, and I'm going through and I'm returning a bunch of emails that I really haven't gotten to yet. And it's like, that's not exactly relaxing activity, but it doesn't exhaust me the same way that it does when all these new messages are coming in,
Yeah.
or somebody's knocking on my door, and it's the constant switching of inputs and having to go back and forth between, I'm at work and now I'm, focusing on things with my daughters at home, and now I'm back at work again. Like all of those kinds of switches are much more exhausting than the focused concentration.
But it's also that latent awareness that you might, if you don't switch, then you might miss something, right?
For sure. One of the studies that I talk about in the book was kind of fortuitous study. So you had these researchers that were looking at Facebook users in Israel, and I think this was it was like 2014, somewhere around there, or maybe it was actually 2020. I can't remember. But they were looking at these Facebook users in Israel and looking at people's satisfaction with Facebook and kind of mental health, et cetera. And while the study was happening, the main server that hosted Facebook for Israel went offline. And so there was this 24-hour period where nobody had access to Facebook. And the researchers were there. And what they saw was, like, right at the beginning, everybody was freaked out because they thought, well, I'm missing out on everything. But then once the news began to spread that Facebook was out for everybody, there was this tremendous feeling of relief. And people reported, these like very happy feelings that I don't have to be on Facebook because I'm not missing anything, because nobody else is on Facebook either.
The joy of missing out, not the fear of missing out.
Right? And that's what they ended up titling
like
their study.
Yeah.
The joy of missing out. And that's part of it too, right? If you know nothing else is coming in and you can't get to it while you're on the plane, you don't feel that sort of nagging sense of, anxiety over what could be there. And, our emotions are a significant source of our exhaustion.
Yeah, because look, a lot of people have written about attention. Gloria Mark, I've had a number of these folks on the podcast, but I think you have this exhaustion triad, because you point out that it's not just attention that is limited, but also you talk about inference and you talk about emotion and how these things can drive exhaustion, because they also require the same finite resources, and not just exhaustion, but it seems like, not just emotion, but emotion management, right? You have to kind of deal with emotion, interpret emotion. You have to, corral your emotion. And it seems like all this digital stimulus is driving the need for more emotional management. It's driving the need to be continuously making these inferences as well, right?
Yeah. So inference is, I think, an interesting one, because our modern digital world makes some things very clear and visible to us, and then obscures other things. And we know that when we're looking at something, right? And we are constantly having to fill in the missing pieces of the puzzle. So you see, there's a Slack message that comes, but there's no context. You get an email and it's copied to 10 people. You got a dashboard that shows you a bunch of numbers, but no explanation of those numbers. So all day long, we are doing invisible work, right, with our brain.
Is this person being sarcastic, or are they being literal?
Great example.
Yeah.
All day long, we're often not, it's not at the forefront of our consciousness, but we're trying to fill in the blanks and identify those missing pieces around all the information that we're exposed to. And doing that is really exhausting, because, you've got to like to make those inferences, which is what we're doing, you have to hold multiple possibilities in your mind. You have to guess about intent. You have to weigh incomplete evidence. You have to anticipate consequences, right? You're always using your working memory, which is fragile and limited. And so,
Yeah, I mean, part of that, if we go back to the
yeah.
parallel versus serial, I mean, if somebody's talking to you in person, right, you're cognitively paying attention to the words, but then you're using visual cues and other sensory cues to kind of infer their mood and their intentionality. And, without that context, you have to somehow infer them, but using your cognitive resources
That's
alone.
right. Exactly, right. And it's not just a process of sort of like information extraction, but you're actually going and doing all this mental gymnastics to try to make guesses and then look for evidence that's going to substantiate your guess. And that's pretty taxing. So inference is really a big driver of exhaustion. And I would say the place that it most shows up, although not exclusively, is in our social media lives, because of course, people are curating their lives in terms of what they post, whether that's LinkedIn or TikTok or Instagram, that doesn't really matter. And we are constantly not only making inferences of them, but what I find is that we're also very often making inferences about ourselves because we see a past record of all the things that we wrote and all of the things that we posted. And then we're also making inferences of what we think other people think about us based on all the things that we post. Like, oh, Paul published a book and he's trying to promote it. Like, he's so self-centered. Is that what people think of me when I post, that I was on this podcast with Greg? And so we are in this like vortex of inference that's happening. And so it's exhausting us from all angles.
Well, the other thing about emotions is that it seems like exposure to social media in particular, and also a lot of the news, it seems to be, to the extent that it is successfully grabbing our attention, it is stimulating fear, anxiety, guilt, anger, like all this other stuff, which then we have to somehow deal with. Right? We have to manage it, suppress it, channel it, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. It is. And that's why this is why I call it the exhaustion triad. So it's not that these are independent forces, really, attention switching, inference, and emotional regulation, that they all act with and in tandem with each other. Just as you point out, that exposure to these online content and trying to fill in the blanks and stuff, right, creates a sense of anxiety or fear, and also then we like switch to look at something else to try to fill in the blanks, and then we've attention switched, right? So you get all of these sort of interactive and somewhat negative effects that just compound. I will point out that one of the things that most gets a laugh when I present this research is I show transcript, and I got many of these, but I show one of a couple who invited me to come to their house in the evening. And the reason they invited me to come to their house was I was speaking with the woman at work, the wife, and she told me that you should see our nightly routine for trying to pick a movie. My husband and I.
Right.
And I was like, well, what do you mean exactly? And she said, well, just come and watch. We'll be done with dinner like around 7:30. So come to my house. Here's my address. So I was like, okay. So I go to their house and meet her husband, nice guy. And so they go sit down and they, go to Netflix, and then they kind of argue over what to watch on Netflix. And they spend, like 10 minutes on Netflix. And then somebody's like, well, actually, maybe the movie we want's on, Disney Plus. And so they go over there and they're looking, and then it's like, no, actually, maybe it's on Amazon Prime. And so they go over there, and then they had to pay for it on Amazon Prime. And they're like, no, we don't want to pay for a movie. So let's go back. And, like 45 minutes or almost an hour goes by, and they've not picked any movie, and they both are frustrated, and they go off to bed. Right. And the reason that one gets such a laugh is like, so many people come up to me like, did you come to my house?
Everyone recognizes that.
Everyone recognizes that.
Yeah.
And it's just one example of these kinds of feelings of like anxiety often, right? That too much digital choice gives us, and we've got that everywhere. Like, what web page do I click on, when Google gives me the search results, or, ChatGPT gives me 7 different potential answers, and how do I choose amongst them? And so we're constantly inundated with so many options, right? These sort of digital opportunities and these pieces of data that come to us, that having to choose between them is exhausting, and even as something that's supposed to be pleasurable, like choosing a movie to watch after dinner.
Yeah, but that creates a demand for someone to basically decide for us, right?
Yes.
So, it could be an AI agent, like you pick the movie for me, or it could be, an authoritarian politician, or somebody who can essentially relieve us of all of this anxiety, right?
Well, that would be nice.
Yeah.
I tried to
Well,
make it. I tried to make it my wife, at least with our
yeah.
movie picking, and then I ended up disagreeing with her choice. So it doesn't really work in the end.
Well, but look, to some extent, this exhaustion might just be because people are amateurs, right? Like they haven't learned how to master this stuff. And I think part of the purpose of the book is to teach people how to master it. When I wrapped up my strategy class earlier this year, or last year, I at the end I said, look, hopefully this class has helped you to um, develop new ways to both process and store data. And it didn't occur to me that I should be talking also about teaching people to kind of manage their energy levels. And there are some tricks, some methods that you suggest. Of course, some of it is it's just like, hey, just cut back on
Right.
your tool usage and so forth. I like this whole discussion of affordances and how you can be sort of intentional about matching the tool with the task.
Yeah.
So how does one approach that so as to optimize one's use of the tools?
Yeah. So I think this is what rule number 2 in the book, called
Yeah.
make a match. And it dovetails on the conversation that we had before about this sort of sequential versus parallel processing in many ways. So if you think about complex situations that you've been in before, where there's not a really clear answer to a problem, you need to talk it through. You need to figure out, is the solution that I'm proposing something that you're likely to agree with, that you'd be amenable to? And there's a lot of work, like socio-emotional and relational work, that it takes to really make effective complex decisions. And a lot of the times we tend to pick technologies, right, pick tools that don't afford, right, sort of give us the ability to have those kinds of conversations and discussions in a way that allows us access to all of those different stimuli that we just discussed. And, a great example of this is if you like have a disagreement with somebody about a decision that you're trying to make, and you end up sending them an email about it or a text. We do this a lot. And in fact, a lot of people that I talk to will tell me that I prefer, in a difficult choice situation, I prefer to use some kind of asynchronous mode. And they don't use those terms, obviously, but the idea is, if I can think a little more clearly, craft what I want to say to you, and send it to you, I'm less emotionally heightened. Or the fear of conflict in this situation, right, is it makes me not want to actually look at you in the eye and talk to you. So it's easier for me to send a text or send an email. The problem is that that text or that email only contains a very limited amount of information. So we're constantly making inferences about everything else that's going on around us. We also don't get our answer usually satisfied very easily. So we have to then create a response email, right, where we ask more questions. There's a time lag, which means now more inference is happening. My email box is cluttering, right? Like it's accumulating because this conversation is giving us, 4, 5, 6, 7 different repetitions of email. But while I'm looking at that, another email's coming in. So I'm switching my attention, right, to something else. And if instead we said, okay, this is a complex problem, I need to meet in person, or we need to get on Zoom so I can see, is this person like, they look happy about this solution?
Let's lock them in a room until they figure it out, right?
Exactly, right? And we can have the real-time conversation, and I can interrupt you, and I can see with your feedback, right, your nonverbal feedback, if you're understanding really what I'm saying. And so the important point here is that different tools afford different kinds of access to stimuli, and they afford different types of communication. And one easy way of reducing our exhaustion is to match the sort of complexity of the task that we're trying to do with the affordances or the capabilities of the technology. And I say match not over exceed, because we also have the problem where, like me, I'm sure you've been in many, many meetings that should have just been an email.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
there isn't the need. And so what we've done in that situation is we've overstimulated people,
Uh-huh.
right, in a setting with 15 other folks, and we've taken an hour out of their day and maybe the travel time to get there. And that has created other avenues for exhaustion, when if we had just received this information via email, we couldn't have had the meeting. So you don't want to overmatch. You just want to like match to the complexity of the task. And that's the key to reducing our exhaustion.
Well, it also probably depends on, the capacities of the individual. So, I was trained as a lawyer, and so, writing documents in clear prose, like this is something that I'm, I understand how you can do that. And
Right.
so if you got two lawyers, they can probably go back and forth with documents in a way that other people can't.
Sure.
But
One
there's
thing that
also a
lawyers,
matching. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one thing that lawyers, do a pretty good job about is being very thorough and covering most of the bases, right, in what they're writing. And so rule number 5 in the book is called wait. And one of the interesting things about that is what the research shows is that if you're doing correspondence and you rather than like respond quickly, you respond more slowly with a more complex and complete message that tries to tackle the issue with its more full complexity, right, and multiple sort of vantage points, that the data shows will reduce the number of email interactions that you have to have with other people, because you have this more complete, thoughtful response that somebody can go and mine for the details they need, not have to shoot back, 15 different, what about this, what about this, what about this kinds of things, which also reduces our exhaustion.
Well, as long as you're sending it to the kind of person who's actually going to read it.
That's true. Well,
So
that's a very good point.
There's other
Very
people,
good point.
you'll send them a document, it's got all the questions answered, and then they'll just email back, what about this? It's like, well, that's 3 paragraphs down. I guess you never went down that far.
That's
right?
when you send them the link to let me Google that for you.com, or stick it into ChatGPT.
But there's another matching principle at work that's implied by one of your recommendations, which is, you have these different communication channels, and, some things need immediate response, some things don't.
Right.
And, for a lot of people I know, if you send them an email, it might take a while. Send them a Slack message, they'll probably get back to you more quickly. If you send them a WhatsApp, you'll get it even more quickly. And so if you can figure out a way to prioritize on that basis, then it's great. The problem is that once people figure out the cheat
what your
code,
prioritization is.
then they take the non-urgent stuff and start stuffing it into your urgent channels. And you talked about this, product manager who figured out how to get stuff done. And of course, they imposed all sorts of externalities on the people that were receiving these messages.
Yeah, which is not great, because of course then that contributes to the exhaustion of the people with whom we're working. This is a place I think where managers, leaders really play a crucial role. So some of the successful organizations that I've seen will, the leaders will create a set of guidelines or a set of norms for the organization about what kind of responses do we expect given things sent via different media. And so if you really need to reach somebody urgently, then you use Slack, let's say, right? And if it's something that can wait for a response and it needs to be a little more thorough, you send an email. So you can kind of list out, like, here are the right kinds of communications for in our organization.
But then there's a race to the bottom, right? Because everybody tries to get one step ahead of the other person to get their stuff done.
Although I think what I have seen, though, for the most part, is if that becomes normative, right, and it's really embedded in the culture, people tend to do a pretty good job of respecting that. I think it's where you don't make it explicit is when you get that, you do figure out the cheat code like you were describing. Because it's like, ooh, well, I know this about this person and not everyone else does, so I'll just be the one that slips something in. But when it becomes an organizational norm that you feel bad about violating that, right? Like I know that this person knows that I'm not supposed to send this if it's not urgent. And so there's a little bit of accountability that goes along with that. And that's a theme, I think, generally for workplace managers that, I always think of the Smokey the Bear saying, right? Only you can prevent forest fires. It's like, only you can prevent tool proliferation in your organization, and to some degree, thinking about what are norms for communication. Really, people are always going to come to you wanting some new application, especially applications that can script other people, through network effects, right? Like a chat platform or whatever. And so I think as leaders, we need to do a better job at really making sure that we're not allowing so many tools into the organization that are going to overwhelm people, because it's really difficult for any individual employee to say, look, I'm not going to be on Slack anymore. Like you can't do that if your team's interactions and the workflows are happening on Slack, or I'm not going to document this in Asana because, it's just like another tool. But as leaders of the organization, we can take some purposeful steps, hopefully in consultation with the folks that are working for us, about setting some guidelines, figuring out what tools we're going to use and not. And I think that is a responsibility of the 21st century manager.
Well, I mean, which manager? I mean, you could have the CIO do this. You could have the HR people. I find it really fascinating how HR and IT are now starting to, work together and maybe even, merge in some companies.
Yes. I was just at an event for an organization yesterday that was co-sponsored by the CPO, Chief People Officer, and the CIO. And they're doing a whole initiative around, generative AI across the organization. I was speaking at that event. And it's really powerful when these two come together. And they, one of the discussions that we had at the end of the day, kind of our just little sit down on the side, was around this, which is, what kind of policies are we thinking about for the organization to make sure that as we, encourage people to be using, more of these generative AI tools in their workflows, that we're also thinking about exhaustion, and we're making sure we're creating good policy around that. And that's something that collaboration between the Chief People Officer and the Chief Information Officer is really powerful for doing that.
Yeah, I love this discussion about batching versus streaming with email and the trade-offs. And I think a lot of people think that if they respond very quickly, this will make other people happy and will impress them. And I love how you point out that oftentimes what that does is make them not take you seriously. Like, well, what's wrong with this person? They got nothing better to do than respond to my emails?
Yeah, are they not thinking through their answers? Why do I get such fast responses all the time? Yeah, I think our Rebecca Hines, who you interviewed recently, right, talks about how a lot of work has become performance theater. And I like that term a lot because
it's like FaceTime, right? In the old days, showing up and,
ooh, well, I'm going to respond quickly so this person thinks, I form positive impressions of me. And that's, as I demonstrate in the book with a couple of different cases, right, that can really backfire. So what we really need to be kind of thinking through is, how do we make sure that we're preserving the time, energy, attention that we need to be doing our tasks? How do we create a communication environment, or just accessing our different digital data that sort of fits into our workflows in ways that allow us to accomplish things without getting exhausted, but also remembering that we work in an ecosystem of many other people who depend on us. And one of the things that I realized after being a very consummate batcher for quite a while, right, I would really be like, I don't look at email during these times of the day. I only look at it at noon, or I only look at it in the afternoon. And I was extremely productive because of that. What I realized was I was, often being inattentive to the needs of some of my colleagues. And so what I really learned was having a fast policy on, I only batch, or I only kind of do things as they come in, is probably not wise. That you have to figure out, given your own flow of work and the interactions you have with your colleagues, do I really put off returning my emails, let's say, till certain hours of the day, but then I'm looking occasionally to make sure if something is coming in that looks really urgent, whether that's on a text or email or, the Microsoft Teams message or whatever it is, that I'm being attentive and responsive to the people that need me.
Well, this is one of the areas where a lot of people think AI can help because, look, most of us don't have personal assistants, but the most productive people, right, the senior people, one of their secrets is having a personal assistant that kind of shields them from the things that would get in the way of their work. And so all of us have a potential for a personal assistant who could be like, look, I'm going to let you know when an email needs to be responded to. I'll check it out. I'll figure it out. I'll read it. And based on everything I know, I'll say this can wait until your 4 p.m. email batch.
Yeah.
But if it's, I mean, I've sometimes done interviews with people on the podcast and they have notifications going off every like 10 seconds. And I'm like, how on earth could someone like that ever be a productive academic if they had notifications going off? So, I mean, can AI help solve the problem, or will this just sort of inspire a new arms race for people to grab your attention?
Well, the jury's really out on that one. And so optimistic, Paul, thinks yes, right? This is going to help us, because what I noticed is the people that tend to be the least exhausted and the most productive are people who are like wide receivers in American football, or like your striker in European football, right? That they get the ball right in front of where they're going to be, right? Somebody makes that great kick and it just lands right to where you're sprinting to, or the quarterback throws it just right to where you're going to run. And that feels amazing, right? Because it's like, I get what I need right when I need it, and I don't get more and I don't get less. And then I'm able to, make my touchdown or kick or make my goal. What's difficult is when you got to turn around and look for the ball and run backwards to get it, right? And that's how most of us are living our lives today. And so I think the thing that an AI assistant could really help us to do, if the technology gets there, and I know a number of companies that are working on this right now, is helping to identify what are the things that we're going to need when we get right there, and put it to us in our stream of work, so that I'm not having to, go over here and try to find it and go over here to try to find that. But that suggestion ends up right in my Google Doc form, right? Or the message that I need to read, ends up inside PowerPoint right as I'm doing my PowerPoint. So I think that's the potential that I'm excited about.
The equivalent for me would be like, I'm going to give a talk, and on my way to the talk, they're like, "Okay, here's the audience. Here's what you're talking about. Like, got your PowerPoints teed up." It's like, great, and that way I don't have to think about it, until I have to think about it.
Right. And you could adjust your preferences. If you want to be thinking about it a week before, you can say, "Hey, I want to be thinking about this a week before," and it gives you when you need it. So I think I'm excited about that possibility. The technology is not quite there yet, though. So I did a study a couple of years ago of this AI scheduling assistant, and it was really tough on the people who adopted it, in large part because they didn't fully anticipate how tacit most of our understanding and knowledge is about scheduling, and also how interactive and complicated a problem scheduling really is. And so you had these AI-powered assistants that would you'd send me an email and say, I want to meet. It would read the email and it would say, okay, well, Greg wants to meet. And it would look at your calendar and look at my calendar and it'd find a time. But there's so much complexity in there, right? And how it decides to respond to you, like I said, does it treat you kind of brutishly, or does it treat you very politely, or does it compliment you? It's making those decisions also. And so the technology is not quite there yet to deal with that magnitude of a problem in ways that correspond to your natural rhythms and patterns around when do I actually want to meet, and do I need space between my meetings to process time, versus just stack them all in. And then, of course, you talked about the cheat code before about, getting onto somebody's radar. Well, that AI could be really good at doing that too, right? To figuring out exactly what are the right modes of persuasion that are going to get you to say yes to this meeting when you don't even want to. And that's a concern that we need to be mindful of.
Well, look, the bulk of the book is focused on the workplace, but when we get home, we're entering into a new workplace, whether it's managing your household or, managing children. And you talk a bit about how, being a parent now is to be continuously bombarded also with all sorts of technologies that, you're monitoring your kids' schedule and grades and whatever. Can we use the same tactics, right? Use the same approaches to try to keep our digital exhaustion at bay after, 5 p.m. as before 5 p.m.?
Yeah, many of the same tactics apply. One example I'll give is there's a gentleman I interviewed who was part of a soccer carpool for his kids. And, there were 3 kids that were involved in this carpool. And he talked to me about how frustrated he was at the number of texts that got sent about this carpool. And some of it was, that the practice times would change week to week. And some of it was, whose other kid, right, has a doctor's appointment. And so they got to take, their sibling to the doctor's appointment, and someone else has to fill in and all this. And so he showed me, and in 1 week there was about 60 different texts that had come through about this one carpool situation to soccer practice. And so one of the things that we talked about was, we think that we're treating this problem as though it is like a bunch of these micro level coordinations. What if we thought about the week instead as a complex, multifaceted coordination problem where there's going to be a lot of dynamics that need to get worked out, and there's going to be a lot of adaptation that needs to happen. And I said, what would you do if you thought about it that way? And he said, well, I would just have a conversation with the 2 other people, like face to face, so we could sort out the whole week. So I said, give that a try. So that's what he did. They got on a Zoom call, actually, and they said, let's just talk about the whole week and who's going to do what. And they nailed the whole schedule down in about 5 minutes, right? And that 5 minutes substituted for about 60 different texts that happened the week before. And way less exhausting to do that 5 minutes. Plus the added benefit, he told me, this is like at the end, we shared a few cute stories about the kids in the car, which we never would have done on the text. And I actually felt like I like these people, which then makes me even more inclined to feel like I want to be involved in this carpool versus this carpool is such a drag. So it's a good example of like the matching principle that we talked about, but thinking about it like how we might re-coordinate in our home lives.
Now, you also talk about mindfulness, right? And being present, being here. And you talk about this idea of complementary opposites. And I really like this notion. I cooking is sort of something I do every day, which is sort of just defrags everything in the brain. And so, do we have more demand for these types of activities as a counterbalance? And why is it that people, when they feel some exhaustion, instead of taking a walk, instead of cooking or something, they turn to YouTube and Facebook as a way to relax, which seems to, not always do quite as good of a job.
Yeah. Well, I think that one reason is that we have this cultural sort of sensibility around, content, like especially, video content, audio content, right, being associated with leisure. And, maybe this comes from a time when we didn't deal with screens and data and stuff quite as much as we do now. And so you
go to the movies. Right?
Yeah, you go to the movies. It was very different, right? It was an escape from your life. Well, we're in front of screens and data and images and video constantly. And so I think finding those opportunities where we can not necessarily be in front of the screens, but be engaging ourselves, finding that feeling of flow in these activities that exercise the same kinds of muscles that we have developed, in our jobs or that we do online, offline, but in an analog kind of way. For me, I find that, like as an academic, my day job is really around like doing research, and I'm, thinking of a project, I'm looking at data, and I'm running some statistical analysis, right? And I'm going back and forth between all these different PDFs of prior research and, Microsoft Word, and I'm doing all these kinds of things. And it's a messy, rough process where I'm like, okay, well, what's the argument here? How do I build it? It's not working. I got to refine it. I find for me that doing like home renovation construction projects is exactly that complementary opposite. It's the same kind of skill, which is I look at the bathroom that I'm trying to remodel, and I'm like, okay, what's the vision for what this is going to look like? What are the steps that it's going to take? What are the tools I'm going to need? And I try something and my framing, like the wall isn't quite as straight as the 2x4 isn't quite as straight as it needs to be, right? I'm like, okay, well, I need to sort of redo this and make sure that it's more level or make sure it's more plumb. And then, but I'm not like on a screen and I'm using my hands. So that's the opposite part, but I'm getting that same sense of like goal fulfillment that I would through, that sort of planning process. And those kinds of activities are great because they end up being that level of difficulty and that level of mental stimulation that just keeps me super engaged. But it does it in a way that feels very fulfilling because I'm using my hands and I'm not in front of the screen. And that's that idea of complementary opposites that so many people talk to me about, in which they find themselves getting this feeling of flow. And then when it's time at the end, they look at their phone and like, nope, don't even want to pick that up. Like I have no urge to go and check email. In fact, it feels revolting to go and check and see if I've got texts because I'm just in this state of happiness and relaxation from being away from the device. And if you can feel like that, that's great.
Well, the fact that you can talk about going and doing a home renovation project within the context of a technology management class, I think this is pretty interesting. So,
yeah.
Paul, thanks so much for joining me. The new book is called
my pleasure.
Digital Exhaustion, Simple Rules for Reclaiming Your Life. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thanks, Greg. It's been a fun conversation.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.